How do you keep Andrew Berry as GM and fire Kevin Stefanski?
Oh, that's a brother now.
Hey, let's analyze this from a macro standpoint.
Teams are hiring. The Falcons got their coach. The Titans hired. They're hiring all these coaches. What is taking so long? The Browns have been working on this for 3 weeks. What's going on?
Hell to the motherfucking nah. This is a ridiculous-ass organization. It's the worst in football. Them New York Jets right there.
They delusional, JB. Haslam and Berry don't think there's nothing wrong with what they're doing. That's the worst component of it.
The Cleveland Browns are spiraling into absolute chaos, and we're not talking about the usual Cleveland disappointments, drafting a quarterback who busts or overpaying for a free agent who underdelivers. This is something entirely different. This is an organizational meltdown happening right before our eyes, and two of the most prominent voices in sports media are absolutely torching the franchise for what might be the most humiliating head coaching search in NFL history. Here's what the Browns are reportedly doing. They're running what they call a data-driven operation to find their next head coach. On the surface, it sounds smart. Analytics, metrics, the Moneyball revolution applied to football. But here's the catch. They're forcing head coaching candidates, some of the sharpest football minds in the game, to fill out questionnaires, write multi-part essays, take personality tests, and complete additional assignments. That's right, assignments. Like these guys are interviewing for an internship at a Fortune 500 company, not leading an NFL franchise worth billions. The fallout? Mike McDaniel and Jesse Minter, two of the hottest coaching names in football, have reportedly pulled themselves out of the running. They looked at Cleveland's process and said, no thanks. That tells you everything you need to know about where this franchise stands right now. Cleveland is treating this head coaching hire like they're filling an entry-level office job. They're making proven football minds jump through ridiculous hoops, asking them to validate their expertise through tests and written assignments, as if their resumes and accomplishments don't speak for themselves. Mike McDaniel just led the Miami Dolphins to multiple playoff appearances with one of the most creative offensive schemes in football. Jesse Minter coordinated the defense for a Michigan team that captured a national championship. These aren't unproven guys looking for their first break. These are elite coaching minds with options all over the league.
They acted like they had real leverage. And, by the way, we want you to take all these kindergarten and elementary and high school level tests just so we can, collect data and information.
That's the level of disrespect we're talking about here. The Browns are treating top-tier candidates like they need to prove they belong in the conversation. It's insulting, and it's exactly the kind of tone-deaf move that explains why Cleveland has been a disaster for the better part of 2 decades. But the testing and homework assignments? That's just scratching the surface. The real dysfunction goes much deeper. According to reports, the Browns are basically telling candidates that if they want the job, they have to keep Andrew Berry as general manager and retain Jim Schwartz as defensive coordinator. Let that sink in for a moment. You're interviewing for one of the toughest jobs in professional sports, and before you're even hired, you're being told who you have to work with and who's going to be on your coaching staff. This isn't how winning organizations operate. This is how desperate, dysfunctional organizations try to maintain control when they've completely lost their way. And the criticism from JB and Shaun isn't just about the bizarre process. It's about what this process reveals about the organization's broken mentality. The Browns just fired Kevin Stefanski after giving him every resource imaginable, after other teams were lining up to hire him away. Love him or hate him, Stefanski had proven he could win, and he had the respect of coaches and executives across the league. But Cleveland's front office decided he wasn't their guy. Fine, coaching changes happen in the NFL. But then you turn around and tell his replacement that he can't build his own staff? That he's stuck with the GM who constructed the roster that just failed? That's not a fresh start. That's setting up the next guy to fail.
If you're Myles Garrett, you're not walking in here and say, what the fuck are we doing? I re-signed with you guys. You guys shitted on me. You've told me nothing. You've done nothing to make us better. We're not getting better. Then you told us we had a defense that was good because of me. Let's be honest. And now you're telling us the head coach has to keep the D coordinator. What head coach wants to go in and take a job?
This is the perspective that cuts to the heart of it all. Myles Garrett is a generational defensive superstar, a player who should be chasing championships, not watching another organizational circus unfold. He re-signed with Cleveland based on promises about building a contender. Instead, he's witnessing the franchise botch another coaching search while telling candidates they can't even choose their own defensive coordinator. How is that supposed to build confidence? How is that supposed to attract top-tier talent? The contrast with other franchises couldn't be more obvious. John Harbaugh just re-signed with Baltimore, but the contract negotiations dragged on because Harbaugh demanded complete autonomy. He wanted control over personnel decisions, the freedom to shape his coaching staff, the authority to run things his way. And you know what Baltimore did? They gave it to him, because that's what winning organizations do. They empower their head coaches. They give them the resources and control needed to succeed. Cleveland? They're doing the complete opposite. They're handcuffing their next coach before he even sets foot in the building. They're creating a situation where failure is practically guaranteed, and then they'll point to their data and say, well, the analytics supported this approach. It's organizational cowardice wrapped in the language of modern analytics. The Deshaun Watson situation hangs over all of this like a dark storm cloud. There's no way around it. Cleveland invested a staggering amount of money and draft capital in a quarterback who hasn't performed at even an average level since putting on a Browns uniform. Whether it's injuries, lack of rhythm, or simply not being the same player anymore, Watson has been a catastrophe for this franchise. And now they're asking coaches to fix that mess while also dealing with all these organizational handcuffs. No wonder Mike McDaniel and Jesse Minter decided to walk away. But here's what makes this even more maddening for Browns fans. This is completely avoidable. This isn't bad luck. This isn't a string of devastating injuries or a controversial call that cost them a playoff game. This is self-inflicted organizational dysfunction. This is ownership and management making one baffling decision after another, alienating top candidates, frustrating their best players, and turning the franchise into a league-wide punchline. The testing obsession deserves closer examination because it reveals something troubling about how modern organizations hide behind data to dodge accountability. When you base every decision on tests, questionnaires, and personality profiles, you create a buffer between yourself and real responsibility. If the hire doesn't work out, you can always say, "The data supported our decision." You never have to admit you made an error in judgment. You never have to trust your gut or own your choices. Football isn't played in a spreadsheet. It's not a computer simulation where you plug in variables and predict outcomes with mathematical certainty. It's a game of instincts, relationships, leadership, and real-time adaptation. The best coaches aren't necessarily the ones who score highest on some personality assessment. They're the ones who can command a locker room, make adjustments under pressure, and get maximum effort from their players. None of that shows up on a standardized test.
It's fail-proof because nobody has to ever get blamed when you approach things like this.
Right.
Because this is what the data said. We didn't make a bad decision. The data's never wrong.
That's the whole playbook. The Browns front office has built a system where they can never be held responsible for failure. When the next coach flames out, they'll point to the tests and say the candidate checked all the boxes. They'll point to the retained staff and claim they provided the best possible foundation. They'll point to the Deshaun Watson contract and say it was an impossible burden to overcome. At no point will ownership or management look in the mirror and acknowledge that they're the common thread running through 2 decades of failure. Cleveland fans deserve so much better than this. They're some of the most passionate, devoted supporters in all of professional sports. They've stood by this franchise through decades of heartbreak, through 1-31 seasons, through crushing disappointment after crushing disappointment. And this is how the organization repays that loyalty? With a coaching search that's become a national joke? With a process so backward that legitimate candidates are removing themselves from consideration before even getting an interview? The contrast with the Jets couldn't be more obvious. Both franchises have become textbook examples of dysfunction, case studies in how not to run an NFL organization. But at least the Jets' problems come from an owner who's overly hands-on, who makes impulsive decisions based on emotion. That's problematic, but it's at least comprehensible on a human level. The Browns' approach is actually worse because it's deliberate dysfunction. They've thought this whole thing through and decided that insulting candidates with homework and stripping away their autonomy is the smart play. There's an uncomfortable truth that this approach doesn't affect all candidates equally. When you build these kinds of barriers, extensive testing, assignments, rigid organizational hierarchies, you're creating a system that rewards candidates willing to jump through hoops and abandon their own vision just to land a job. Is that really how you want to find your next head coach? By selecting the person most willing to surrender control to the front office? The quarterback situation absolutely cannot be ignored here. Cleveland has Deshaun Watson locked into a massive guaranteed contract, and they might be drafting Shedeur Sanders with a top pick. That's a potential disaster waiting to happen. A new coach is expected to navigate that minefield while also working under all these organizational restrictions, while answering to a GM who built this mess, while keeping a defensive coordinator he didn't hire. It's a setup for failure, and everyone outside the organization can see it.
We don't kick field goal stuff. It's maybe the dumbest evolution in football of all the things that evolved over the last 25 years is the fact that these guys have convinced themselves that points are insignificant.
This connects to a bigger issue about how analytics and data can be weaponized in football. Yes, data matters. Yes, numbers can inform smart decisions. But when you let data override common sense, when you use analytics as a shield against responsibility instead of a tool for improvement, you end up with situations like this Browns coaching search. You end up with teams making fourth down decisions that defy logic. You end up with organizational paralysis disguised as innovation. So what's going to happen next? Cleveland will eventually hire somebody. They'll hold a press conference and talk about how thorough their process was, how much data they analyzed, and how confident they are in their selection. And then that coach will walk into an impossible situation, restricted by organizational constraints and burdened with a roster featuring both Deshaun Watson's crippling contract and potentially a rookie quarterback learning on the fly. The coach will probably survive 2, maybe 3 seasons before getting fired, and then the whole cycle will start over again. Because that's what the Browns do. They keep repeating the same mistakes while convincing themselves that this time is different, that this time the data will save them, that this time they finally crack the code. But you can't fix organizational dysfunction with personality tests and essay questions. Cleveland will remain exactly what they've been for the past 2 decades, the NFL's most reliably dysfunctional organization.